without further delay, please turn your attention to Vincent Roy-Di Piazza and his presentation, From Temporal to Spiritual Freedom, Swedenborg on African Superiority, Colonialism, and Slavery.
Well, thank you, Thane, for this introduction and for inviting me to speak today. I'm delighted to be with you, and I wish I could be there in person in Brynäthen. But I'm joining you instead from the city of Uppsala in Sweden, where Swedenborg himself, as you know, is buried. It is really dark, cold and snowy in January there, but since I get to visit Swedenborg every day, I feel like I can't complain. It's great to be so close to the great man himself. Now I'm going to speak for 45 minutes, starting with an introduction, and then proceed to the talk in 3 parts with takeaways for consolidation at the end of each part. I also want to point that for those of you who are interested further in the topic of Swedenborg and slavery, this talk is based on an article that I published on the subject in the an academic journal called the Intellectual History Review. It should appear on the screen now as the second slide. If it doesn't, Thane, let me know. And the article was published in April last year, so feel free to check it out if you want more details and the references of what I'm going to talk about. The article is open access, so it's fairly easy to find and to read and download. And I wanted to start with one of the pictures that I use in the article. This double portrait might be familiar to some of you. It was painted by Frederik von Breda in London in 1789, the year of the French Revolution. And it depicts the Swedish abolitionist Carl Bernhard Wachtström with his friend, the West African prince Peter Panna of Cape Mesurado in present-day Liberia. Wachtström and Panna met during Wachtström's travel to West Africa. Years later, as he was living in London, he came across Panna, his friend, who had been enslaved. Wachtström redeemed him, and then they posed together for Frederik von Breda in a double portrait, which became a famous example of abolitionist painting, where a white and black man stand side by side as friends. There are many striking elements to analyze in this portrait, but today I'd like you to look at what Wachtström is pointing with his finger. Let's take a closer look. With a closer look, we can read some parts of a title and perhaps some initials as well. It's only the beginning of the talk, and yet I imagine the suspense is already killing you, so I'm going to give you the solution. What Wachtström actually points to is this. Wachtström is pointing to a book by Swedenborg, published 15 years earlier in Amsterdam. A book called Sapientia Angelica de Divina Providencia, the angelic wisdom on the divine providence. The identification of this book seems to have long eluded commentators outside of Swedenborgian circles, and yet it is only one of many titles by Swedenborg which contains various points about slavery. In the case of Sapientia Angelica, here is one of the many quotes it contains which Wachtström is seemingly pointing to. I'm going to read the quote now that appears on the slide. Every man wishes to be free, and to remove not freedom, but slavery from himself. Every boy who is under a master wishes to be his own master, and so to be free. The Lord teaches us in John that we are slaves when we are in our sins, and that the Lord liberates us when we accept truth from him through the word. Now, this quote is a perfect example of Swedenborg's lesser-known positions on the links that he saw between slavery as the institution of bound labor and slavery as the spiritual enslavement towards sin and the false religion. So what immediately struck me when I found this was that although I had seen a lot of literature published about the roles of the Swedenborgians in the early history of British abolitionism, yet there wasn't a single study, it seems, centered on Swedenborg himself, on slavery, and on his ideas about Africans in his very own time. So in this talk, what I'd like to do today is to explore three aspects of Swedenborg's thought that are related to these views, three aspects which have received little attention from scholarship until now. The first element is that Swedenborg was the first prominent Swede to condemn slavery as early as 1741. And this is not only early or even earlier than within Swedenborg's own corpus than previously acknowledged, but it is also early in general for the 18th century as a condemnation of slavery. And the second aspect is idea of slavery as a punishment in the afterlife for wicked European missionaries who intrude on African communities. And that's a conception of slavery that encompassed both temporal and spiritual enslavement with a remarkable anti-colonial stance. And the last element is Swedenborg's striking idea that Africans are superior to all other people. By looking at this, the main question we will address in the talk is how can we explain Swedenborg's views on those topics, and where do they stand in the landscape of the Swedish Age of Liberty, this period of time in the 18th century in which Swedenborg lived in. So the paper and the talk is going to be structured in three parts. In the first part of the talk, we're going to get a sense of how big of a topic slavery and Africans were for Swedenborg, and whether he met Africans or not during his life. Then we will get a look at his views on colonialism and indigeneity. And then we will look in the final part at getting an overview about debates on Africans and slavery in the period of the Swedish Age of Liberty. And as we delve into the argument, I just wanted to perhaps give a couple of biographical landmarks about Swedenborg. We have the luxury of dealing with a specialist audience tonight. It is quite a luxury, so everyone knows who Emanuel Swedenborg already is. So the point of these biographical landmarks is not so much to get into the details of Swedenborg's life. It is more to chronologically situate his ideas on Africans and slavery and where they stand within his life and career. So roughly what we see there is that Swedenborg's career can be roughly divided into two parts. The first part after his graduation, where he works as an assessor at the Bureau of Mines of Sweden for 31 years, making contributions during that time to various disciplines within the realm of natural philosophy. And then in the mid-1740s, Swedenborg starts to refashion himself as a theologian. He retires from the Bureau of Mines in 1747, and from this point on dedicates himself to theology, spiritual reform, and describing the afterlife, mostly through conversations with the dead. Although his first statements on slavery took place on the side of his anatomical work, so that's in the first part in orange on the slide, it is only after his well-known and so-called divine calling in 1745-1744 that he starts to form opinions on Africans and to think about slavery in spiritual terms. So during the last 25 years of his life, Swedenborg worked as a religious reformer with extraordinary powers, which brought him considerable fame and also controversy. It is a well-known paradox that many believed in Swedenborg's powers, while finding at the same time his theological views difficult to swallow, and that's in his own time. So we know that in this last 25 years of his life, Swedenborg claimed that he was able to have daily conversations with the spirits of the dead, with demons, angels, and sometimes even God himself. that he was able to explore the various planes of heavens, of hells, the intermediary world of spirits, and even other planets in the afterlife. And he was adamant that this had nothing to do with magic. This was the result of a miraculous gift from God. And so it is mostly during this later period that Swedenborg publicized his views on Africans and slavery, the same views which would later influence his abolitionist followers. Okay, so we now enter the first section of the talk, where we are going to discuss two questions. And the first of those is, how extensive was Swedenborg's corpus on Africans and slavery? When I started to approach and get interested into this topic, I just assumed, I think a little bit like everyone, I knew about a couple of quotes here and there, so I assume it was quite a marginal topic. And I knew that he was scattered across different works. It doesn't have a dedicated volume, but then what struck me is that it is actually larger than I thought. So if we use a little bit of visual representation to try to get a better sense of the corpus. So the corpus can be split between the published and the unpublished works. So on this slide, you can see a visual representation of the published works. Within the 12 published works in which either of those topics are present, we see 34, I've counted 34 occurrences of Africans across 10 different published works, exclusively in theological context, whereas slavery as a wider spread as a topic, with 58 occurrences across 12 published works, and which encompass non-theological titles as well of anatomy and poetry. There is a large overlap between the two terms in Swedenborg's 10 theological works, which points to their interconnectedness in Swedenborg's religious doctrines. And if you're interested in the references about all those works, the detailed references, you can find them in the article, and also like the original Latin terms in which I based the search. If we now look at a representation for the unpublished works, within the 9 unpublished works featuring these terms, slavery is extensively discussed, with 36 further occurrences in 5 works, while Africans are mentioned in equal measure, but across a wider spread of works, with 35 occurrences across 7 unpublished manuscripts. There is less overlap between the two topics in the manuscripts, although the places in which they overlap are foundational, significant works. So if we use now chronological representation to get a sense of the emergence and overlap, we see that slavery emerges earlier in Swedenborg's work than his interest in Africans, which starts in December 1747. That's the first discussion of Africans, which happens in the Spiritual Diary. We also see that discussions of Africans almost coincide straight away with African superiority. So if we do a bit of a breakdown on Swedenborg's corpus, what we see, namely, is that slavery as bond labor is discussed as early as 1741. Slavery is also discussed more often than Africans, and that's because slavery is a wider topic. It encompasses both temporal slavery and spiritual slavery. Africans are discussed from 1748 onwards, or like December 1747, and almost immediately and consistently they are presented as superior from then on. And both are mentioned together mostly in Swedenborg's theological works. In other words, once I gathered that data, I figured there was enough there to warrant a new extensive investigation. So the second question is, did Swedenborg actually meet Sub-Saharan Africans apart from his accounts in the afterlife? So we have clues that lead us to think that Swedenborg has had some actual encounters with enslaved Africans during his life. We should point here that Swedenborg's global interest for slavery and Africans in general probably resulted in part from the extensive amount of time that he spent abroad, about 20 years abroad, 13 years in London, about 5 years in Amsterdam, both cities which were cities of trade where Sub-Saharan Africans could be observed in various conditions of servitude. Some descriptions sort of got me really thinking. Swedenborg made some nice niche descriptions in manuscripts, in particular in the very first accounts in the spiritual diary. Swedenborg mentions a meeting in Amsterdam with possible enslaved Khoisan speakers. In this account, Swedenborg said that there is a group of African spirits who told him, after weighing their words out of fear, that they had been maltreated because they were black, yet longed for deeper things. And there is an expanded account of this experience in Arcana Celestia, which elaborates that in their former life, these Africans spoke with a kind of click or collision, which seems to be a rare reference to the click consonants common to the South and East African locutors, the so-called Hottentots in the 18th century, which were frequently enslaved. I don't have the time to go more into detail there, but there is more in the article. But Swedenborg makes also remarkably accurate descriptions of garments, clothing, which are in line with the kind of clothing that these enslaved Africans would wear at the time. Another layer of context to Swedenborg's views on African Africans is to try to pinpoint whether he actually knew some African individuals personally, and not perhaps only meeting them in the streets or seeing them in the cities that where he was, but actually knowing some African individuals. And here, I think there is an interesting candidate for that, and that would be Gustave Badin, the freed Kammermoor and foster son of the Queen of Sweden, Louisa Ulrika. Gustave Badin was the most famous and one of the few Afro-Swedes in the 18th century. There's been interesting research done on Gustave Badin recently. Badin is a French adjective that was given to him as a nickname. Badin means mischievous. Gustave Badin, his real name was Cauchy, was born in the Danish West Indies. And the nickname Badin, mischievous, was given to him because he was, once he was given to Louisa Ulrika, he became the subject of a Rousseauist experiment in education in 1757. In other words, Gustave Badin was allowed to roam free in the palace, in the royal palace, and to address anyone, including the highest members of the Swedish court, by their first names. And he was well known for playing pranks on the members of the royal family and of the members of the court. And he was allowed to roam free, uncivilized, until a process of civilizing and Christian education started, and was started by the court chaplain Nathanael Tenstead. Through this process of trying to civilize Gustave Badin, he was baptized in a public ceremony which was attended by the whole royal family, and the experiment was deemed to be a tremendous success in 1763. That's the year before Sapientia Angelica is published. Gustave Badin became a pious Christian and a remarkable citizen, and like Swedenborg, he also had some markedly dissenting religious views, which I thought were quite interesting. We're lucky enough to have the diary, the personal journal of Badin, which has survived, and in there is very interesting extracts, for instance, on the fact that Badin's views on deeds and charity are redolent of Swedenborg's, that they both reject the Lutheran doctrine of salvation by faith alone, sola fide. And the reason why Gustav Badin and Swedenborg could have met is through Swedenborg's privileged relationship to the Queen of Sweden, Queen Ulrika, who convocated Swedenborg to the court to make a demonstration of his powers in the early 1760s. From this point afterwards, we know that Swedenborg frequently dined at court with members of the whole royal family. And at these dinners, Gustav Badin would have been there. But you know, regardless of whether Swedenborg and Badin actually talked together, it is most likely that Swedenborg at least saw in Badin's conversion a confirmation of his views that enslaved Africans had a remarkable spiritual plasticity, that they would embrace the right doctrines if they were taught to, or would even be keen to embrace some of his own doctrines. We don't have any traces in Swedenborg's writings, some nominal mentions of Badin, and it's the same the other way around. Badin never mentions any encounters with Swedenborg at the court, nor any members of the royal court, for that matter. So we're arriving now at the end of this first section of the talk, and what we've seen as a sort of takeaways to regroup, we've seen that there is a large but scattered theological corpus, mostly theological corpus on Africans in slavery in Swedenborg. We're unsure whether Swedenborg met Africans. We have no hard evidence of it, yet we have interesting hints at possible in-life encounters. And it is quite likely that Swedenborg met Gustav Badin, or at least that he had him in mind when crafting his example of the spiritual virtues of enslaved or formerly enslaved Africans. Right, we now enter the second part of the talk, where we get a look at Swedenborg's views on colonialism and indigeneity. And one aspect that I want to start with in the second part is a relatively overlooked aspect of Swedenborg's thought, that's namely his interest in indigenous people. This occurs and happens quite early on in his writings. Swedenborg, in one of his earliest poems, published in the compilation Ludus Heliconius, which was translated in English by Hans Elander in 1995, in this compilation of poems, Swedenborg writes Ovidian-inspired poetry on the primordial purity of the Sami, who live under the Hyperborean sun. The Sami individuals were frequently studying at the University of Uppsala, where Swedenborg studied, usually to train as clergymen, and then return to Lapland to become pastors in their communities. And we find interest in the indigenous people of Sweden in Swedenborg's writings across various decades. In 1743, in the Fiber, the unpublished anatomical manuscript, Swedenborg comments on the anatomical, he does anatomical research on trying to find the biological basis for the extraordinary powers of the Sami Nohaides, the Sami shaman. The key takeaway here is that Swedenborg is praising the connection of indigenous people and the Sami to their environment and the spiritual powers and the closeness to God that comes with it. Swedenborg depicts them as native Gentiles. Another layer in relation to this interest to indigenous people could be found in Swedenborg's family background. His own father, Jesper Svedberg, the prominent Swedish bishop, was basically the most important administrator of Swedish missionaries and evangelization abroad. He was a prominent member of the London Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and as a bishop, he was in charge of administering not only the bishopric of Skara, but also the Swedish churches in London and Portugal. and he even nicknamed himself the Bishop of America because of his pastoral administration of the Swedish settlers in the former colony of New Sweden. So Swedenborg's father was, in other words, a global evangelizer and administrator. Swedenborg had strong family ties to missionary conversion and Swedish presence abroad, and that went even beyond his father. Is Swedenborg's cousin, Andreas Eselius, who visited Swedenborg while he was in London, in his first stay in London in 1710 or 1711, during his Grand Tour. Andreas visited Swedenborg, the young Swedenborg, on his way to the former colony of Nya Sverige in New Sweden, which stood on the North American territory of, I think, present day it's Delaware, mostly Delaware. And on this territory, a Swedish presence was maintained through the whole of the 18th century, despite having been lost as a territory to the Dutch and the English in the 17th century. So these Swedes that were present there needed pastoral care and supervision from the mainland. So this gives us a better picture of Swedenborg as someone who thinks of spreading his revelation on a global scale, because people in his family are already doing that. They're spreading and maintaining the word and the revelation on an international and even transatlantic scale. As Swedenborg started to refashion himself as a revelator with global missionary ambitions in the 1740s and before writing on Africa, Swedenborg had initially envisioned in another project to convert the Jews and rely on their help and assets to establish a New Jerusalem kingdom in Holy Palestine. The reference for this is in the unpublished manuscripts, The Messiah About to Come from 1745. And long story short, the Jews didn't comply. This was a long-running objective for Christian missionaries, the conversion of the Jews in the early modern period and even before. So the Jews didn't comply to Swedenborg's project, and this prompted Swedenborg to redraw his plans. Swedenborg believed that his revelation needed a people and a land to spread across the world. This is why he then claimed that there was a New Jerusalem realm in Central Africa that had been evangelized by angels and steered directly by the spirit of Augustine of Hippo, who was, according to the patristic tradition, the Bishop of Africa. At the time, the inner parts of Central Africa were little known to Lutheran missionaries. So those claims gave his followers a sense that they were part of a global phenomenon. For his followers later on, his abolitionist followers, like the abolitionist and alchemist Augustus Nordenskjöld, who would end up nicknaming this elusive New Jerusalem realm in Central Africa the land of Afriska. For him and other Swedenborgians, finding this realm became a crucial impetus to take part in the Sierra Leone settlement. Swedenborg even drew a prospective sketch of the map that was dictated to him by African spirits, the map of this elusive land. And you can see on the left slide a scan of the page where this map is represented. This map was influential to his followers and nourished attempts to interpret it and even feed it, even quite late into the 19th century when African cartography was more advanced. So on the right of the slide, you can see an interpretation of the map by the Swedenborgian Fred Bos, I think from 1883. And Bos thought that to make sense of the map and make it correspond to the actual temporal geography on Earth, you don't only need to expand the drawing made by Swedenborg, but you also need to turn it upside down. And that's because, Bus argued, because of the inverted doctrine of cardinal points in the afterlife. This is quite fascinating stuff. The narrative of the New Jerusalem realm in Central Africa was part of a plan to bring growing populations of enslaved Africans to Swedenborg's doctrines. His remarkable doctrines about African superiority can also be seen as part of this strategic shift. Sub-Saharan Africans are spiritually superior because they are more prone, Swedenborg says, to embrace his teachings about the New Jerusalem. And so on the slide you can see what has become a very famous engraving from the first English edition of Swedenborg's Conjugal Love. And this is the engraving where African angels in the afterlife are educating European angels on the topic of conjugal and divine love. And this gets the subtitle with the quote, Cidaris erit Africo, the tiara shall go to the African. So it's with fresh missionary ambitions in mind towards the growing populations of enslaved Africans that Swedenborg developed the specific parts of his wider doctrine of spiritual slavery, which presents bound labor as a divine punishment in heaven for European missionaries. And on the slide you can see there the watercolor by William Blake, reader of Swedenborg, on slavery, which seems to depict this tension between temporal and spiritual slavery very aptly. When he writes so, Swedenborg, when he writes so, that I mean about the those missionaries who get enslaved in the afterlife, Swedenborg has in mind the Jesuits, of course, whom he says in his De Telluribus in Mundo Nostro Solari, his world and other planets, that they are the worst possible spirits and missionaries that can exist across the whole universe. So on top of the Jesuits, Swedenborg has two Protestant organizations that he sees as rival missionary groups towards enslaved Africans and indigenous communities in the New World. And those are the Quakers on the left of the slide with the hats, and the Moravians on the right. Swedenborg's anti-colonial comments thus read as a byproduct of this rivalry. European missionaries, such as the Jesuits, the Moravians or the Quakers, should not intrude in African lands to teach false doctrines. The Africans are better left undisturbed. They have no use for spiritual falsities and concerned with deeds and charity. Swedenborg, in his own word, writes in Vera Christiana Religio, the true Christian religion, Africans have no use for new arrivals from Europe who believe that people are saved by faith alone, and therefore just by thinking and speaking, not by willing and doing. So again, a couple of takeaways as we conclude this second part of the talk. We've seen that Swedenborg early on rewrites popular tropes at the time, inspired by Ovid. He makes these rewritings of the trope of the bon sauvage, the good savage, the noble savage, even though that's a term that he never uses himself. He idealizes them, indigenous Africans, as Gentiles who are uncorrupted by the nefarious influence of Western civilization. They are closer to God and to their natural environment. We have seen that Swedenborg's statements partially read as missionary strategy. The statements on African superiority are in part strategy of missionary evangelization to bring them to his doctrines. And finally, we'll see that bond labor slavery in heaven is a punishment for rival missionaries, and that's within a wider doctrine of emancipation from sin, where bond labor slavery is presented as a punishment that has a spiritual counterpart in the afterlife. Okay, and we now enter the last part of the talk, where we get an overview of debates on Africans and slavery in the Swedish Age of Liberty, and that's so we can be able to situate the wider context in which Swedenborg is making those claims and whether they stand out or not from those of his colleagues and what is happening in Sweden at the time. So as we've seen, Swedenborg lives in the period which is called the Age of Liberty. It is a period in which Sweden has lost its colonies. It has no colonies left. Back then, it's recovering from the Great Northern War, which lasted 20 years and which Sweden lost. It is an age characterized by the end of the absolute monarchy, and the parliament, and specifically the House of Nobles to which Swedenborg belongs, is dominating and effectively ruling the country. The parliament dominates over the king. And it is also the period of great achievements in the realm of Swedish science, with the foundation of the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, the Kungliga Vetenskapsakademien. And this period, as we can see with the dates on the slide, actually exactly coincides with Swedenborg's career. So when you are making a history of Swedenborg whole life, it also happens most of the time to be a pretty exact history of the Swedish Age of Liberty, the period in which he lived in. So when Swedenborg makes his first remarks, Sweden has no overseas colonies left. And in fact, there is no slave trade in Sweden until after the end of the Age of Liberty, which happens in 1772. That's the year where Swedenborg dies. And he doesn't live to see it, but Gustav III does a coup d'etat and reinstalls absolute monarchy in Sweden. And from there, he pursues very actively a resuming of colonial expansion for Sweden, and Sweden eventually succeeds in buying the Caribbean island of Saint Barthélemy from France in 1785. And from this point on, Sweden becomes a transatlantic slave nation. And so when you're looking at Swedenborg and the debates around him on Africans and slavery in the preceding decades, you're really looking at the debates which precede but also build up the resuming of this colonial expansion in the Scandinavian country. As we saw, Swedenborg issued his first moral condemnation of slavery in an anatomical treatise, his treatise Economia Regni Animalis, which was published in London and Amsterdam in 1741. This was 1 year after the Negro Slave Act, which aimed to tighten control over enslaved Africans following the Stolo Rebellion, which was the largest slave revolt in British North American colonies, led by Black Christians from the Congo. Back then, slavery wasn't central to Swedenborg's wider anatomical argument. The quote where he condemns slavery reads, "Men who are born into slavery end up losing all sense of liberty." His reviewers didn't pick it up. It was central to his wider anatomical argument in trying to prove the existence of the human soul, and yet such a condemnation was a big deal already, especially when you see what liberty represents in Swedenborg's philosophy and later on in his theology in relation to free will, to reason, and spiritual salvation. This publication in 1741 also coincides with the actual foundation and his induction shortly after at the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, the KVA. And it is around this time that Swedenborg's views on Africans started to grow at odds with those of his colleagues at the Academy, who all applied their anatomical background and knowledge to produce scientific assessments arguing in favor of African inferiority. Those two key figures are the famous botanist Linnaeus on the left of the slide, who is Swedenborg's cousin by marriage and is nominated for membership at the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. And on the right, Abraham Bäck, the most famous Swedish physician in the 18th century, also known for being Linnaeus's best friend. As some of you might know, Linnaeus started revising his classification of humans in the 1750s. Linnaeus is very famous for his Systema Naturae, his work of taxonomy, where he classified all of nature, an ambition to classify all of nature, including making hierarchies of human varieties, in which he ranked Africans at the bottom consistently. And in the late 1750s, he started to add even physical and moral attributes, which ranked them at the bottom, moral traits based on humoral doctrine. So Linnaeus had prejudices against Black Africans, which Swedenborg never shared. That's the key takeaway here. Some other colleagues at the Academy went even further in their prejudiced assessments than Linnaeus. Abraham Bäck is a good example. In 1748, so the year where Swedenborg is starting to record his first interactions with African spirits, Abraham Bäck publishes in the Transactions of the Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences an article that you can see on the slide called Rön om negrarnas svarta hud, which translates as opinion on the black skin of Negroes. And in this article, Bäck is rejecting the classical climatic explanation behind the blackness of human skin, and instead he is favoring ideas of innate humoral imbalance, and he embraces and tries to justify dismissive biblical traditions such as the curse of Ham, the idea that the blackness of the human skin resulted from a curse that was bestowed upon the descendants of Ham by Noah. And we know that Swedenborg thoroughly rejected this biblical tradition, and we know he did so because we have the line-by-line exegesis of the book of Genesis that Swedenborg did in Arcana Celestia, and those are the passages where the statements on the curse of Ham is happening. So if you're interested in Swedenborg's arguments for debunking the curse of Ham, which Abraham Bäck tried to save, you can, I refer you to the article where I develop his views. Some other colleagues, Swedish colleagues, were at odds again with Swedenborg's views. One of those was Per Kalm, the famous disciple of Linnaeus. Per Kalm had traveled to stay with indigenous American communities in the New World, and he came back with very negative assessments of indigenous Americans, which he dismissed as, I quote, savages with no history. And another interesting reference is Swedenborg's own cousin, the historian and chamber councillor, Henrik Julius Voltemat. You can see his crest on the slide. I wasn't able to find a portrait of Voltemat. There might be one perhaps at the Riddarhuset in Stockholm. We'll see. Voltemat, who was Swedenborg's direct cousin, published a 4-volume history in 1741 and 1742, so at the same time, titled History of the Greatest European, Asian, African, and American States. And in this, he provided very detailed accounts about African lands. He wrote in particular about the savagery of barbaric Nigerian slavers, the lapsing Christian faith of the kings of the Congo, differences in productivity and docility about different ethnic tribes, and the profits, the insane profits of the slave trade that the French, the Dutch, the English, and the Portuguese were reaping in the region. What Voltemat was effectively doing was providing information and data to guide the prospective resuming of colonial expansion for Sweden. If you should start again to be a slave nation, we should focus on these particular parts of Africa, because some groups there are more docile than others. So, a couple of takeaways as we conclude this third part. We've seen that Swedenborg's statements on Africans and slavery are recurring while he is part of those scholarly circles. I call them Linnaean circles because Linnaeus is so famous and influent at the time. Those are circles that revolve around the newly founded Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences, which was itself an offshoot of the Swedish House of Nobility. It was overwhelmingly populated by members there, a member of the Hat Party of Sweden, the ruling Hat Party. Swedenborg, like his colleagues, they all have a common interest in Africans and the origins of blackness and all of these questions, but Swedenborg stands out as being someone who has and formulates early objections to slavery. Swedenborg, in contrast to his colleagues who were trained in anatomy, like himself, refuses to apply his anatomical knowledge to try to discuss blackness. He rejects the curse of Ham, as we have seen. He is privy to the debates of his time, but he notably refuses to classify Africans as inferior. And that's despite Swedenborg's own extensive background in anatomy. So, to conclude with a couple of wider general conclusions, beyond making contribution to Swedenborg and his followers on the history of Africans and slavery, I think the key contributions of today and of the paper are that we've seen how much of a striking voice Swedenborg has on Africans and slavery during the relatively neglected period of the Swedish Age of Liberty. I can tell you there is not a lot of research that has been done on that, and that's mostly because Sweden as a country didn't have a lot of colonies at that time. No colonies, in fact. So it's just been assumed for a really long time that there is nothing to say on colonialism and slavery, but Swedenborg is right on in the middle there, and from there you can identify all of these networks that we talked about, Linnaeus, Bäck, Kalm, etc. We've seen that, so we got a sense of those debates about slavery and Africans in the Swedish Age of Liberty. We've seen that Swedenborg reharnesses the declining trope of the noble savage to challenge narratives of African inferiority and slavery. The trope of the noble savage, this term which Swedenborg doesn't use, but nevertheless it is what it is about, this idealization of the supposed purity and idealized relationship of indigenous people to their environment. This is a narrative that it is losing ground in the 18th century, in part also to allow for an increase in colonial expansion. You can't steal the land, you can't conquer the land and take it away from indigenous people if they are still noble, if they are good. So this is why you see the adjectives of noble and goodness being replaced by a pure savagery. So Swedenborg is fighting against that. He is revitalizing, reharnessing this trope in a very creative way during this period. Another aspect which is not new but confirmed further, I would say, it's the fact that millenarianism and millenarian thought provided a decisive influence on the emergence of early abolitionist sentiment. Swedenborg, even though he is a peculiar representative of millenarianism, is viewed still that the apocalypse, as described in Revelation, has taken place, has been completed by 1757, provides the starting point. It provides the starting point for what is basically a generational shift. We've seen that in Swedenborg's theology, slavery still exists in heaven as a punishment for evil missionaries. Whereas for within one generation, it is really striking how, thanks to his writings, his utopian followers envisioned the possibility of the abolition of slavery here and now, energized both by Swedenborg's groundbreaking theology and perhaps as well by the extraordinary changes that were brought by the French Revolution. The legacy of his followers is a different story and a talk perhaps for another time. Thank you very much for your time. Please feel free to connect if you enjoyed this talk. And this is a screenshot of the article if you want the reference for it. And in the meantime, I look forward to discussions and your comments. Thane, up to you.